They will tell you the Pritchard name is gone because time forgot it. That is a lie. The truth, the real truth, is that their name was removed. Cut out, deliberately, methodically, and with the kind of precision you only see when someone in power decides that what happened must never reach another living ear. And yet, you are here. You've already stepped past the point of no return. What I'm about to tell you isn't just the story of a family in the backwoods of Georgia. It isn't just about missing brides. This is about a system, one that still exists, that decides who gets remembered and who gets erased. A machine of silence that feeds on people's lives. In the hills outside Carterville, where the river bends like a coiled serpent, the remains of the Pritchard estate rot beneath layers of vines and time. People avoid it, but not because of superstition. No, they avoid it because there's a quiet agreement in this county. We do not talk about the Pritchards. Between 1842 and 1863, 47 women entered those gates as brides. Not one of them ever left. You've heard urban legends, the kind whispered at campfires, but this is different. There's a paper trail. There's evidence that the family's fortune wasn't built on cotton alone. And there's a trunk, unearthed in 1987, containing documents so revolting that 3 historical societies refused to authenticate them, choosing instead to bury the entire find in legal red tape. The Pritchards weren't savages in the way you imagine. They weren't backwoods killers. They were precise, strategic, and what they did to those women and why wasn't born of passion or madness. It was ritual. It was engineered. The patriarch Cornelius Pritchard had 5 sons. All stayed, single far beyond what was acceptable in Southern society at the time. Publicly, they claimed to be searching for worthy wives. Privately, they were building something else, something you'll begin to see as we descend. The house itself was wrong, not odd, not unusual, wrong. Each wing could be sealed off completely. Some rooms in the basement had no windows at all, and the doors, thick oak bound with iron, were overbuilt to the point of obsession. The slave quarters were placed almost a mile from the main house, not for efficiency, for isolation, to keep certain sounds from reaching certain ears. Cornelius' explanation for the property's distance from the road was simple: privacy for agricultural work. That was a lie too. It was about control, who could come in, and more importantly, who could leave. The first disappearance we know of happened in September 1843. Jeremiah Pritchard returned from Augusta with a bride named Sarah Petton, a young woman whose life was already collapsing after her father's death. She had no power, no money, no strong family to protect her. Perfect prey. The wedding was conducted in near total secrecy. No public church service, no formal invitations. The carriage that brought her to the plantation was covered in heavy canvas, so no one could see her face. And it arrived just after sunset. Witnesses noted that it was driven not by a slave or family member, but by Tobias Hartwell, one of 3 mysterious overseers, whose backgrounds dissolved into nothing when anyone tried to investigate. That carriage stayed on the property for 3 days. No music, no voices, no celebration. Then, on the 4th morning, it left, empty. Jeremiah appeared in town weeks later, alone, saying Sarah was resting and that her delicate nature made social introductions unwise so soon. People believed him. It was a culture that romanticized female fragility. They didn't realize fragility was being used as a cage. And this is the first truth you must understand before we continue. The Pritchards weren't hiding from their neighbors. They were hiding in plain sight, using society's own rules as their camouflage. We will keep going deeper. But understand, every word from here forward is a step into something you cannot unlearn. You've heard the story of Sarah Petone, but you must understand something. She wasn't the beginning. She was simply the first recorded disappearance. The Pritchards had already perfected their process by then, and like any system designed to operate in the shadows, it depended on two things: pattern and patience. The pattern began long before the carriages and the covered canvas. It began with selection. The brothers never sought women with powerful fathers, influential uncles, or brothers who could come looking. They wanted isolation wrapped in lace. Women who were already adrift, financially, socially, emotionally. In the antebellum South, marriage wasn't romance. It was survival. A woman without a husband was one illness away from starvation, and the Pritchards understood that desperation could be leveraged like a weapon. When the brothers traveled, never all at once, always staggered, they carried. With them more than money, they carried a script, a rehearsed narrative of wealth, stability, and opportunity. They could adapt it for any audience: the protective mother, the skeptical uncle, or the girl herself. What made them so effective was how believable they were. In towns where cotton fortunes were rising, the sight of a wealthy planter's son expressing personal interest in a modest young woman was intoxicating. It was the Southern fairy tale, the merchant's daughter elevated to a lady of means. Once the prospect was hooked, the isolation began. Letters were frequent at first, then became selective, always hinting at grand plans, while warning of untrustworthy people who might try to interfere. This was psychological conditioning. The young women began to believe that their only advocate in the world was the man courting them. By the time marriage was mentioned, there was no resistance, only relief. But here is where the second ingredient, patience, came in. The Pritchards could wait months, sometimes years, for the right moment. If a suitor had to return empty-handed from a trip, it didn't matter. The plantations, wealth insulated them from urgency, and when the time came, the wedding was always private, always on Pritchard soil, always without the oversight of a church congregation or the prying eyes of neighbors. They never used the same preacher twice. Local records show traveling ministers would arrive for family services, often paid in gold or gifts instead of currency, and then vanish from Bartow County entirely. You see, it wasn't only the women who disappeared, so did the witnesses. The plantation itself was a stage, carefully arranged to swallow people whole. The long approach road, the 3 bridges, the sealed wings of the mansion, it was all an architecture of control. Each piece designed to ensure that once you were inside, the outside world might as well not exist. And here's something the official histories don't mention: several of the sealed rooms beneath the main house had flooring made not of stone or wood, but of thick, compacted earth. Why? To absorb sound. Think about that. The overseers, Hartwell, Lowry, and Vance, were the operational muscle. They were not planters, not agricultural men. They were handlers. Each had skills far more suited to confinement, transport, and disposal. Neighbors noticed their precision with tools like rope, locks, and pulleys. These were not the marks of fieldwork. These were the marks of control. By 1845, the disappearances had become almost annual, and yet no alarm was raised. Why? Because the victims were strategically invisible to the system. They had no property to claim, no brothers to petition the courts, no social standing to force an investigation. The Pritchards didn't just understand their society, they weaponized it. And here's the part that should chill you. Their methods are still used today. Not in the same form, not with the same tools, but the architecture of disappearance is eternal. It's built on the same foundation. Find those no one will look for. Make them depend on you. Remove them quietly in a few minutes. I'm going to tell you what was really in that 1987 trunk. But before we get there, you need to see how the family's reach extended far beyond their land. Because this was never just about weddings. It was about something older, something ritualistic, and once you hear it, you won't be able to go back to thinking this was just murder. Asterisk, you've been told the Pritchards killed for greed. You've been told it was lust, cruelty, or madness. But the truth is far older and far colder. What happened inside that house was not chaos. It was choreography. When the 1987 trunk was pried open in the basement of a demolished carriage house, most expected letters, maybe an account book, perhaps family photographs. What was inside was deliberate. The documents were arranged in 3 bundles, each wrapped in oilcloth, each labeled in a hand so neat it felt unnerving. The first bundle contained invitations, not for weddings, but for suppers. Dozens of them, each bore the seal of the Pritchard estate and the names of guests who were never mentioned in county society columns. Guests from Charleston, Savannah, and, strangely, New Orleans. The dates always coincided with the arrival of a new bride. The second bundle was worse. Diagrams. They were floor plans of the mansion, not as it stood, but modified with markings and annotations. Some rooms were drawn in exact scale, but with strange symbols instead of furniture. One basement chamber, with no recorded purpose in county blueprints, was marked with a black triangle. Above it, in tight script, observation must be maintained until the 3rd hour, the 3rd bundle. That one didn't make it to the historical archives. The man who first saw it, a county workman named Gerald Finn, told his wife it was just a collection of prayers. But years later, drunk and dying in a veteran's home, he told a different version. He said the papers weren't prayers. They were instructions, lines of scripture rewritten, rearranged, and paired with precise sequences of action. One phrase appeared over and over. The union of the unseen. It wasn't until a researcher from out of state, a woman named Ruth Calder, quietly obtained photographs of a few pages that the full implication emerged. Calder had studied West African spiritual systems, Catholic heresies, and early Masonic ritual. Her conclusion was blunt. This was not a family of planters. This was a family maintaining a covenant. Think about that word, covenant. It means an agreement, a binding promise between 2 parties. One is human, the other is not. The missing brides weren't trophies. They weren't even victims in the usual sense. They were offerings. Here's how it worked. The wedding night, always private, always sealed, marked the bride's symbolic transfer, not into marriage, but into the covenant. The sealed rooms, the earthen floors, the observation until the 3rd hour. It all aligns with known ritual structures that combine confinement, deprivation, and invocation. This was the Pritchard family's real crop. Not cotton, they cultivated absence. The overseers weren't merely there to maintain order. They were facilitators, guardians of the process. Hartwell's rope skills, Lowry's brute strength, Vance's sharp eyes. These weren't random talents. They were essential tools in controlling an offering from the moment she arrived, until the covenant was completed. And here's where the real horror takes root. These offerings were meant to vanish completely. No burial, no marker, no body. The absence itself was the fulfillment. One of Calder's notes, recovered from her abandoned rental car in 1991, read, "The absence is the signal. The absence feeds the oath." Absence, that's the thread you'll see again and again in this descent, in history, in modern power structures, in the ways people disappear without a ripple. It's not a flaw in the system, it is the system. We are halfway down the first spiral now, and I need you to understand, this is where the danger begins. Because if you follow me further, you will see how absence is engineered in your own lifetime. You will see the architecture, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. The next thing we're going to talk about is the third hour. The timing the Pritchards guarded so carefully, and once you know what it meant, you'll understand why no bride ever survived it. The third hour, it was more than a time on the clock. It was a threshold. Every document in that trunk that referenced it did so with precision. Never around midnight, never before dawn, always the third hour. For the Pritchards, that meant exactly 3 hours after the bride crossed the threshold of the sealed wing. You need to understand something. These women weren't dragged in kicking and screaming. Not at first. They were welcomed, dressed, sometimes even given a meal. The illusion was maintained right up until the door shut and the lock turned. Then the clock began. From the few accounts, pieced together whispers from escaped slaves, a diary fragment from a traveling minister who vanished a month later. We know the first hour was silence, utter, complete silence. The bride was left alone in a bare room with no windows, just the sound of her own breath, and the faint smell of earth rising from the floor. The second hour introduced presence, not sight, presence. Steps outside the door, the sound of something being dragged, a faint knock that came from the floorboards beneath her feet, not from the hallway. This wasn't random cruelty. It was preparation, dismantling the mind's defenses, one brick at a time. By the time the third hour arrived, the woman was no longer standing on her own terms. Fear had already stripped her identity. That's when the overseers entered. And here's the detail that turns this from cruelty into calculated ritual. They entered carrying no weapons. Hartwell would step in first, rope coiled at his side. Lowry next, closing the door. Vance last, locking it from the inside. The room would fill with the smell of oil and something sweet. Molasses, maybe, or something older, fermented. The bride would be seated in the center of the room, and then they would wait. Not speak, just watch. For an exact length of time, 180 heartbeats. Calder's notes say this mirrors a Masonic inversion ritual, where the subject is made to believe they are the center of a circle of witness. Only after this silent vigil did the real act begin, and here, the records stop being explicit. Not because there's no evidence, but because the evidence that does exist is layered in coded language. The covenant sealed, the absence confirmed, the path maintained. Whatever happened in that third hour, it was the culmination, when the door opened again. The woman who had entered never came out. This is why the basement floors were earth, why the rooms could be sealed from every angle. Sound could not escape, the process could not be interrupted, and most importantly, there would be no trace left for any accidental visitor to find. One fragment from the missing minister's diary is particularly telling. They do not kill as men kill. They remove as if removing a shadow, and yet the air changes after. Do you understand what that means? It means the Pritchards weren't simply ending lives. They believed they were altering something larger, the very balance between presence and absence in the world. And that's why the third hour mattered. In ritual structures across cultures, 3 hours marks a liminal state, the point at which the body's will begins to fracture and the mind's resistance is at its weakest. This was the moment the covenant could be fed. Here's the part most people miss. The Pritchards didn't invent this. They inherited it. The covenant, if Calder's research is correct, had been maintained through at least 3 generations before Cornelius. The plantation was simply the latest stage, rebuilt to accommodate the precision the ritual required. We will go deeper into those generational roots in the next section, because that's where the real rot begins. It's older than Georgia, older than America itself. But before we descend into that history, I'm going to ask something of you. Comment this phrase twice, exactly twice, and nothing else. Absence feeds the oath. It isn't superstition. It's how we mark those who have crossed this threshold with me. How the algorithm knows who's already too deep to turn back. If you're still here, we're going to Europe next, and you'll see where the covenant was born. Asterisk, they had no name for the sound. No word in the English language could capture the way it clung to the walls, the way it dripped into the ears and crawled toward the brain. It was not screaming, it was not crying. It was something in between, something ancient, something primal. It came from beneath the hospital, from the very sublevel that was supposedly sealed decades earlier. The workers tried to tell themselves it was a trick of the wind, that the draft through those rusted vents could howl in peculiar ways. But when the night shift was quiet, and the halls emptied of patients' murmurs and nurses' hurried footsteps, the noise grew clearer sometimes. It would be a low, slow wail, like a voice that had been buried and was now pressing upward through the dirt. Other times, it was sharp cutting, like someone had just realized they were not going to be saved. And then there were the words, because that's what the senior staff feared the most, that the sound was speaking. It didn't speak in sentences, but in bursts, fragments, 3 or 4 syllables at a time, and none of it made sense unless you believed the old records. Those records, yellowed, fragile, and nearly illegible, told of therapeutic confinement chambers deep underground, rooms where the patients who were considered beyond recovery were kept, not for treatment, but for study. The doctors never called it torture. They had cleaner words for it, clinical words. They spoke of stimulus tests and neurological endurance trials. But in truth, it was something far more sinister, something the local papers in the 1920s were paid to forget. And if you believed those whispers, then the voice was not the wind, it was not the plumbing, it was not the creaking of old pipes. It was them, the ones they swore were dead. They were not alive in the way you and I understand life, not breathing in the ordinary sense, not eating, not sleeping. Yet they existed, trapped between the final gasp and the silence of death. The rumor was that their hearts had been stopped, only to be restarted with crude, experimental devices, that their brains had been forced into a cycle of collapse and reawakening, over and over, until time itself lost meaning for them. They didn't live, they persisted. When the janitor, a man named Howard Reeves, first heard the voice through the vent in the old boiler room, he thought it was a prank. He even laughed until the sound said his name. Not Howard, not Mr. Reeves, but Howie, the name only his mother used when she was angry with him. A name he hadn't heard in 20 years. That night, Howard refused to work alone. He kept to the upper floors, but the noise followed him, as if the hospital itself was carrying it upward, piping it into the very walls. And then the smell began. It was not rot, not exactly. Rot has an ending, a final stage, where the body returns to dust. This was different. It was sweet at first, like syrup left too long in the sun. But beneath it was something metallic, a sting in the back of the throat that made the eyes water. Old. Staff knew that smell. They called it the warning. It meant a door below had been opened. The sealed rooms weren't sealed anymore. Asterisk, the decision wasn't brave. It wasn't noble. It was desperate. 2 orderlies, a nurse named Ellen, and Howard Reeves stood in the stairwell leading down. No one wanted to be first. But the sound, low, rhythmic, almost mechanical, was getting louder. Not a heartbeat, not quite a machine either. Something in between. Howard went first. The others followed with flashlights that seemed weaker. The deeper they went, as if the dark was thick enough to drink the light hole at the final landing. They found the heavy door. Its hinges were orange with rust, its paint cracked like old skin. But the lock was new, brushed steel, gleaming. Untouched by time, Ellen spoke first. "Someone's been here, recently." Howard reached out. The lock was warm. When it clicked open, the sound they'd been chasing for weeks poured out. Not in volume, but in weight. It pressed against their chests, crawled into their ears, and settled somewhere deep inside the skull. The room beyond wasn't large, but it was crowded. Metal tables lined the walls. On each table was a body, not decayed, not preserved, but caught. Skin pale, veins dark as oil, eyes wide and moving. They were breathing, if you could call it that. Slow, shuddering intakes, followed by pauses too long for any living thing. Then one of them, a man with a scar across his throat, spoke without moving his lips. "We were never meant to wake up." Ellen dropped her light. It rolled under a table and stopped in the half-glow. They saw wires trailing from the bodies into the walls, vanishing into the concrete-like roots into soil. Somewhere deep in the building, something fed them, and they understood the truth. No one in that room was a patient. They were the experiments the hospital was built to protect. Howard stumbled backward, his breath shallow, his mind clawing for logic. But there was no logic here, only design. Ellen whispered, "What do we do?" Her voice was barely audible over the slow, choking breaths of the bodies. Howard wanted to answer, but something behind him moved. They turned. The door they came through, now closed, not slammed, not locked, just shut. From the darkness beyond it, a shape emerged, tall, thin, its face a pale oval of nothing. It didn't walk. It slid forward, as if the floor itself carried it closer. One of the men on the tables exhaled sharply, then another and another. All at once, they began to breathe in perfect unison, the same rhythm they had heard for weeks. The shape stopped inches from Howard. It leaned close, and a voice not from its mouth, but from inside his head spoke. "You came looking, now you stay." The lights died. The sound of breathing filled everything. The police report filed 2 days later claimed the sublevel was empty, the records erased, the stairwell bricked up. And yet, in the quietest hours of the night, if you stand outside the old hospital walls, you can still hear it. That same slow, mechanical rhythm. Inhale, pause, exhale, and if you hear it, don't follow it, because some doors, once opened, never close again.